In the dead of winter, a single mother stood on the edge of everything she had left. Her daughter's funeral costs were piling up, and all she had to offer was the last thing that connected her to her late husband, a winter coat. As she made the painful decision to sell it, she never expected a stranger to step in. But sometimes, when all hope seems lost, an unexpected act of kindness can change everything. Madison, a single mother, sat in her small apartment, surrounded by bills she couldn't pay. Her daughter Lily had been sick for months, and the medical bills had drained what little money they had left. Now that Lily was gone, the funeral costs felt impossible to cover. Each day Madison fought against the cold, but nothing was colder than the emptiness in her heart. She had done everything she could to make ends meet, but the money just wasn't enough. Her job at the diner didn't pay enough for food, let alone the funeral expenses. With no one else to help, she was left staring at the last thing she had from her late husband, his old winter coat. It was the only thing left that carried his memory, the scent of pine and leather still lingering on the fabric. Her hands trembled as she held it. She knew she had to sell it to pay for the funeral. The coat was all she had left, but her daughter needed a proper goodbye. Desperation filled her heart as she made the painful decision to part with it. No mother should have to make this choice, but Madison saw no other way. The wind outside was harsh, cutting through Madison's thin sweater like a knife. She stepped out of her apartment, the cold instantly biting at her exposed skin. The coat she had worn for years, the one that reminded her of her late husband, was now gone, folded neatly and tucked into a bag. Without it, she felt exposed and vulnerable, the cold air stinging her bones. She hugged her arms tightly around herself, but it didn't help. The bitter winter was relentless, and it was nothing compared to the pain she was carrying inside. Her heart ached as she walked down the street to the pawnshop. Each step felt heavier than the last, the weight of her decision pressing down on her. The thought of selling the coat, the last piece of her husband she had left, made her stomach twist, but she had no choice. She couldn't let Lily's funeral go unpaid. She had to do whatever it took. The bell on the pawnshop door jingled as she stepped inside. The shop smelled of old wood and dust, and the man behind the counter looked up without much interest. Madison approached him, holding the bag with her husband's coat. "I need to sell this," she said quietly, her voice barely a whisper. The man examined it, looking for any flaws. "Best I can do is $20, he said, barely glancing at her. Madison's heart sank. She had hoped for more, but she knew this was all she could get. $20 wasn't even enough to cover the basics, but it was all she could do. She took the money, her hands shaking as she forced herself to smile. It wouldn't bring Lily back, but it was the only choice she had left. Madison walked slowly down the sidewalk, each step heavier than the last. The cold cut into her skin like 1,000 needles, and her breath came in quick, sharp bursts, visible in the frosty air. The $20 she had just received felt like nothing, not enough to make any difference. It couldn't bring Lily back, and it couldn't fix the endless pile of bills she faced. The streets were quiet, and as she walked, she tried not to let the tears come. She was too tired, too exhausted, but the pain of losing her daughter was still too much to carry. Just then, a sleek black car slowed down beside her. The sound of its engine hummed, smooth and powerful. Madison glanced up, barely noticing the expensive vehicle, thinking it was just another car passing by. She didn't have the energy to care. But then the car stopped and the window rolled down. A man in an expensive suit leaned out and looked at her with sharp, appraising eyes. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice deep but distant. His eyes flicked over her quickly, taking in her thin sweater, her trembling hands, and the way she was struggling against the cold. He paused for a moment as though unsure what to make of her. But something in her expression must have caught his attention, because he hesitated, his gaze lingering longer than necessary. Madison, still feeling the harsh sting of the cold, just nodded quietly, unable to speak. She couldn't explain, couldn't tell him how much she was hurting, how the world felt like it was falling apart around her. It wasn't just the cold air, it was the weight of her grief, the crushing sense of failure that made her feel small, invisible. She didn't have the energy for a conversation with a stranger. She just wanted to get home and curl up in the warmth, even if it was an empty warmth without her daughter. But the man wasn't done yet. To her surprise, he stepped out of the car, his long coat billowing in the wind. Madison watched as he walked toward her. His footsteps were sure, and even though he was well-dressed, he didn't seem bothered by the cold. He reached her side and without a word, he shrugged off his coat and draped it over her shoulders. The warmth hit her like a wave. It was instant and soothing, a stark contrast to the freezing chill that had been tormenting her moments ago. For a moment she stood still, too shocked to react. The coat was thick and soft, the kind of warmth that she had long since forgotten. She could smell the faint scent of cedarwood and something rich and expensive, but the warmth that wrapped around her felt like something more, like a lifeline she hadn't expected. She instinctively clutched it tighter around her, as if it could protect her from more than just the cold. "Take a deep breath," the man said softly, his voice a little gentler now, though still distant. "It's all right." The kindness in his words, the simple gesture of giving her his coat, overwhelmed Madison. She hadn't expected this. No one had ever stopped to help her like this. No one had ever given her something without wanting anything in return. She tried to hold back the tears, but it was no use. The relief hit her hard and she couldn't stop herself. The tears flowed, hot and fast, as she pressed her hand to her mouth, trying to control the sobs that escaped. For a long moment she just stood there, trembling not from the cold, but from the weight of everything she had been holding inside. The sadness of losing Lily, the pain of seeing her life fall apart, the exhaustion from days and nights of struggling to keep everything together. It all came pouring out in that moment and she couldn't hold it back any longer. The man stood still beside her, clearly uncomfortable, unsure of how to react. But he didn't leave. He didn't tell her to pull herself together. Instead, he simply stood there, allowing her to cry, his presence somehow comforting in its quiet strength. She didn't want to cry in front of him. She didn't want to seem weak. But the kindness he had shown her had cracked something open in her. When her tears finally slowed, she wiped her face with the back of her hand, embarrassed by how vulnerable she had become. The man watched her, his expression softening just a little. He looked at her for a moment longer, as though trying to figure out what to do next. Then, with a quiet sigh, he stepped back. "Are you sure you're okay?" he asked, his tone now warmer, more genuine. Madison nodded, her voice barely a whisper. I'm all right. Thank you." The man gave a small, almost uncertain smile before stepping back toward his car. "Take care," he said before getting back in and driving off, leaving Madison standing there in the warmth of his coat, still trying to process everything that had just happened. It wasn't much, but in that moment it was everything. As Madison sat in the warmth of the car, she finally felt the tension in her body ease. The cold, which had made her shiver uncontrollably just moments ago, was now a distant memory. She hadn't realized just how much she needed to escape the biting wind until she was wrapped in the warmth of the car and Nathaniel's coat. Her hands, still trembling from the cold, began to steady as the heater hummed quietly. For the first time in a long while she felt a little bit of peace. Nathaniel kept his eyes on the road, but there was something in his posture that told Madison he was thinking, reflecting. It was clear this was an unusual situation for him. They didn't say anything at first. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable, but it wasn't easy either. Madison wasn't used to being around people like him, someone so wealthy, so distant from the struggles she lived with every day. Finally, Nathaniel cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "So, Madison," he began, his voice sounding softer now, "how long have you been living here?" Madison blinked, surprised by the question. She hadn't expected him to ask anything personal. But then again, he had already done more than she could have imagined by offering her the coat and the ride. "A couple of years," she said, her voice quiet. "After Lily's father passed away, I had to find a place I could afford on my own. It's not much, but it's home. For now." Nathaniel nodded, his eyes focused on the road. "I'm sorry about your husband," he said, the words genuine. "That must have been really hard." Madison smiled weakly. "It was. He got sick really quickly. And then it was too late. There was nothing I could do. And now, I'm left trying to figure out how to survive on my own." She wasn't sure why she said so much, but something about Nathaniel made her feel like she could speak honestly. Maybe it was the kindness in his actions, or maybe it was the fact that she felt like he was really listening to her. Either way, the words kept coming. "My daughter Lily," Madison continued, "she was everything to me. She was strong and bright, but..." Her voice caught in her throat and she looked away, blinking away the tears that threatened to fall. "She's gone now. And I'm just lost. I don't know what to do next." The sadness in her voice was undeniable, and for a moment the car was silent. Nathaniel seemed to be processing her words, and she could tell he was struggling to find something to say. But before the silence grew too heavy, he spoke again. "You've been through so much," he said softly. "I can't imagine how hard it must be. I'm not used to hearing stories like this. My life is so different from yours." Madison glanced at him, surprised by his honesty. He wasn't trying to sound better or explain away his wealth. He simply seemed to be acknowledging the vast difference between their lives, but without judgment. It was strange, comforting even. As they neared her apartment, Nathaniel slowed the car. Madison's heart sank a little. She didn't want this ride to end. But just as she was about to open the door, Nathaniel spoke again. "Madison," he said, his voice quieter now. "I know it's not much, but I want to help. I've got a business and we're trying to start some local projects. People who understand the struggles of others like you could really make a difference." Madison frowned slightly, not quite understanding. "What do you mean?" she asked, unsure of where he was going with this. "I mean, I have a job opportunity for you," Nathaniel said, his eyes meeting hers for a brief moment. "It's part-time, flexible hours, and it pays well enough to make a real difference. It's not charity, it's a job. I think you're someone who could help in ways that others can't." Madison stared at him in disbelief. "A job? For me?" she asked, almost in shock. Nathaniel nodded. "You've been through so much, but you've managed to keep going. I respect that. This isn't a handout, Madison. It's a chance. You can work, and if you need help getting back on your feet, I'm here." For a moment, Madison didn't know what to say. She'd never imagined someone like Nathaniel would offer her something like this. A job, a chance to build something again. This wasn't something she'd ever expected. She had no idea if she was ready for this, but the offer was real, and the warmth of his words made her feel like it was possible. I don't know what to say," she whispered. "You don't have to say anything right now," Nathaniel said gently. "Just think about it. If you want to take it, it's there for you." As they pulled up to her apartment building, Madison couldn't help but feel a little less alone. Nathaniel hadn't just given her warmth, he had offered her something that could change everything. And for the first time in a long while, she began to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was hope for a new beginning. After Nathaniel dropped Madison off at her apartment, the warmth from his coat still lingering around her, she felt both grateful and uneasy. The ride had been more than just a warm escape from the cold, it had been an unexpected conversation, a window into a life she hadn't imagined. But now, standing at the door of her small apartment, Madison couldn't shake the feeling of discomfort. The offer Nathaniel had made kept swirling in her mind, like a faint echo she couldn't escape. She wasn't used to being helped. She had always managed on her own, doing whatever she could to survive. When Lily's father had passed away, she had fought hard to keep things together for her daughter. Now that Lily was gone, it felt like she was losing her grip on everything. But taking Nathaniel's offer was different. It felt like admitting defeat, like accepting that she couldn't do it all on her own anymore. Madison stood at the door for a moment, hesitating before she stepped inside. The warmth of the apartment was a relief from the cold night air, but the silence felt heavy. She could hear the faint ticking of the clock on the wall, the only sound in the room. Her thoughts were loud, tangled in confusion and doubt. She thought about the job offer again. Nathaniel had made it clear, it wasn't charity. It was a job, an opportunity to regain some dignity, something she could work for. But the idea of accepting help from a stranger, no matter how kind he seemed, felt like swallowing her pride whole. She had always taken care of herself and her daughter. Asking for help, especially from someone so far removed from her world, felt wrong. Madison dropped her purse onto the table and sat down on the couch, burying her face in her hands. She could still hear Nathaniel's voice in her head, offering the job. He had been insistent that it wasn't charity. But it felt like it was. The idea of working for him, of depending on him in any way, was hard to swallow. She didn't want to be seen as weak. She didn't want to feel like she was asking for handouts. But then there was the reality. The funeral. The bills. The rent that was due. She had been doing everything she could just to stay afloat, and yet it never seemed enough. She needed to provide for herself and for Lily's memory. That thought hit her with a weight that made her chest ache. She wasn't sure how much longer she could keep pretending everything was fine. The grief was still raw, and the exhaustion from keeping up appearances was starting to show. Madison stood up again and paced around the room, wringing her hands. Her pride told her to turn down Nathaniel's offer. Her grief, however, told her she couldn't keep pretending she had it all together. The pressure of keeping up with the bills and the funeral expenses was overwhelming. She thought about her daughter again, Lily's bright smile, her laughter, the way she had lit up every room she walked into. Lily had deserved more than this. She deserved more than Madison could provide. And now, in the silence of her empty apartment, the weight of all her responsibilities felt crushing. But then there was Nathaniel's offer again. It wasn't charity, he had said. It was a job. She could regain some control over her life, do something meaningful, something that would help her stand on her own feet again. It wasn't just money, it was a chance to start over. A chance to rebuild herself, even if it meant leaning on someone else for a moment. Madison sank down onto the couch again, her thoughts swirling in every direction. She thought about the funeral she could barely afford, the rent that was still due, the piles of bills she didn't want to face. She thought about how it felt to be constantly in survival mode, never able to catch a break. And she thought about Nathaniel. His kindness. His offer of help that came without strings attached. He wasn't asking for anything in return. He just wanted to help her. The more she thought about it, the more she realized something. Her pride wasn't going to change anything. It wasn't going to bring Lily back. It wasn't going to pay for the funeral. It wasn't going to fix the problem she had in front of her. But the job offer, if it was real, might help her get back on her feet. It was a way forward, a way to start again, and maybe, just maybe, it was exactly what she needed. With a deep breath, Madison reached for her phone. Her fingers hovered over the screen as she debated calling Nathaniel. It felt like a difficult step to take, but it was also the only step that made sense. Her heart was still heavy with grief, but there was something else too, hope. A small, fragile hope that maybe this offer wasn't a weakness, but a chance to rebuild, to take control of her life again, even if it was just a small piece. Madison dialed Nathaniel's number. The phone rang once, then twice before he answered. "Hello, Madison?" His voice was warm and steady, as if he had been waiting for her call. "I've thought about it," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I'll take the job." Nathaniel's response was immediate, and she could hear the relief in his voice. "I'm glad to hear that. We'll make sure it works for you." As Madison ended the call, she sat back against the couch, her heart pounding in her chest. It wasn't easy. It wasn't what she had imagined for her life. But it was the right thing to do. For the first time in a long while, Madison felt like maybe she wasn't alone in this. And for the first time in a long while, she felt like she had a chance to stand on her own 2 feet again. Over the next few days, Madison found herself thinking more and more about Nathaniel's offer. She had agreed to take the job, but a part of her still couldn't quite believe it was real. She wasn't sure what kind of work she would be doing or how exactly it would help her get back on her feet, but the idea that someone so far removed from her world, someone with so much wealth and power, wanted to offer her a chance was both confusing and comforting. The day she was scheduled to meet Nathaniel at his office, Madison couldn't shake the feeling that something about this situation wasn't entirely what it seemed. She had spent her whole life trying to survive, trying to make things work on her own. Accepting help from anyone, let alone a billionaire CEO, felt like something she wasn't sure how to handle. But she had to try. The funeral expenses were still hanging over her head, and she had nothing left to lose. When she arrived at his office, she was surprised by the stark contrast between her world and his. Nathaniel's office was sleek and modern, with floor-to-ceiling windows that showed off the city skyline. The polished wood and expensive furniture were a far cry from her small apartment with its peeling walls and worn furniture. But when she walked in, Nathaniel didn't seem like the high-powered CEO she had imagined. He greeted her with a warm smile, his presence calm and kind. "Madison, I'm glad you could make it," he said, standing up to shake her hand. "Thank you for the opportunity," she replied, feeling awkward in the polished setting. "I wasn't sure what to expect." Nathaniel motioned for her to sit. "I understand. And I know this is a big step for you. But I want you to know it's not about charity. It's a real job with real opportunities. You're not here because of pity. You're here because I believe you can help, and you deserve a chance to rebuild." Madison nodded, trying to take in his words. She felt grateful but still unsure. The idea of working in a place like this with people so different from her was a little intimidating. Nathaniel could sense her hesitation. He paused for a moment, then sat across from her, his expression softening. "I know this is a lot to take in, but I want to be clear about something," he said. "I've been where you are. I know what it's like to struggle, to feel like you're doing everything you can, but it's never enough." Madison looked at him, surprised. "What do you mean?" Nathaniel leaned back in his chair, his gaze distant for a moment as he seemed to reflect on something. Then he spoke, his voice quieter than before. "When I was a kid, I didn't have the life you think I've had. I grew up in a poor neighborhood. My mom worked 2 jobs just to keep food on the table. I remember nights when we didn't have enough to eat, or when the electricity would be cut off because we couldn't pay the bills. My clothes were always secondhand, and I never knew if I'd be able to get the things I needed for school. It was hard. It felt like we were always on the edge of falling apart." Madison's eyes widened. She had never imagined Nathaniel had struggled like that. He didn't look anything like the young boy he described. He was dressed in a designer suit, his appearance polished and confident. But now, hearing him talk about his past, something shifted in her. He wasn't just a billionaire CEO who lived in a world she could never understand. He was someone who had faced hardships just like her. I didn't have a lot of choices growing up, Nathaniel continued, his voice steady but carrying the weight of his past. I was lucky enough to get a scholarship to a good school. It wasn't easy and I had to work even harder to prove myself. But I didn't forget where I came from. I know what it's like to feel like you don't have any options, like you're stuck in a situation you can't get out of. And that's why I want to help. Madison sat there in stunned silence, absorbing his words. She had always believed that people like Nathaniel, people with wealth and power, had never known true struggle. They lived in a world where everything was handed to them. But hearing him speak about his own past made her realize that wealth didn't protect someone from the hardships of life. Nathaniel's success hadn't come easily, it was built on years of hard work and overcoming obstacles. He was proof that no one was immune to the struggles of life, regardless of how much money they had. Nathaniel seemed to notice the change in her expression and gave a small smile. I don't want you to think that I'm offering you this job out of guilt, Madison. I'm offering it because I believe in you. I've seen what you're capable of even just in the short time we've spoken. I know it's not easy to accept help, especially when it feels like you're giving up something important. But I'm not asking you to give up your dignity. I'm asking you to take a chance. I'm offering you a real opportunity to make something of yourself, and I think you're worth it. Madison felt a lump form in her throat. She had always believed that asking for help was a sign of weakness. She had spent years trying to survive on her own, convinced that asking for help meant she had failed. But now, sitting across from Nathaniel, she understood that accepting help didn't mean giving up. It meant being strong enough to admit that you couldn't do it all alone. I didn't know, she said softly. I never imagined that you'd gone through something like that. I thought you were different. Nathaniel chuckled lightly. We all have our stories, Madison. We all have our struggles. It just looks different depending on where you're standing. Madison took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his words settle in her chest. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel so alone. She had come into this meeting unsure of what to expect, but now she realized that Nathaniel wasn't just offering her a job. He was offering her a chance to change her life, to build something new. And for the first time in a long time, she felt like maybe that was possible. I'll take the job, she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. Thank you. Nathaniel smiled, a genuine warmth in his expression. You won't regret it, he said. This is just the beginning. As Madison left his office, her heart felt lighter than it had in weeks. She still had a long way to go, and the grief of losing Lily would never completely fade, but for the first time in a long time, she saw a future that was possible. Nathaniel's offer wasn't just about a job, it was about giving her a chance to rebuild, to rise above her circumstances, and to move forward with her head held high. She wasn't alone in this anymore. And that realization made all the difference. As the days went by, Madison slowly began to adjust to her new role at Nathaniel's company. The first few weeks were tough. Everything felt so different from her life before. She had been used to struggling, to doing everything on her own, and now she was in an office, surrounded by people who seemed to have their lives together. But as she settled into her work, she realized something important. This wasn't just a job, it was a chance to rebuild her life. Nathaniel had kept his word. He didn't just give her a position, he gave her a purpose. The work was challenging, but it was also rewarding. She found herself getting more involved in the local community projects Nathaniel had talked about, helping families who were facing the same struggles she had once known. It gave her a sense of pride that she hadn't felt in a long time. Every day she felt like she was making a difference not just for herself but for others too. Her relationship with Nathaniel also began to shift. At first she had seen him as a distant billionaire, someone who was offering her help out of charity. But as time went on, she realized that Nathaniel wasn't just helping her because of pity. He genuinely cared about her and her future. He had been through his own struggles, and he understood what it meant to feel like you had no options. His support wasn't just about money, it was about giving her a chance to regain her dignity and her independence. Madison never forgot the moment when Nathaniel had shared his past with her. His honesty and vulnerability had made her see him in a new light. He wasn't some unreachable person up on a pedestal. He was someone who had worked hard to get where he was, just like she was working hard to rebuild her life. And that shared understanding made all the difference. They weren't so different after all. As Madison continued to work at the company, her life slowly began to change. She was able to pay off some of the bills that had been weighing her down, and she even started to save a little money. The apartment that had once felt like a place full of struggle and grief now felt more like a home again. There were still moments when the pain of losing Lily felt overwhelming, but those moments didn't define her life anymore. Slowly, piece by piece, Madison started to feel like she had control again. One afternoon, a few months after she had started working at Nathaniel's company, she received a call from him. It was unexpected, but there was something in his voice that made her pause. "Madison," he said, his tone serious but warm. "I've been thinking about the work you've been doing, and I want to offer you more responsibility. There's a leadership role coming up with the community projects, and I think you'd be a perfect fit. You've shown real passion for this work, and I want to see you take it further." Madison's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't expected anything like this. A leadership role? She had come so far already, and the idea that Nathaniel thought she was ready for more filled her with a mixture of excitement and disbelief. She had never imagined she would be in a position like this. Someone who was now in charge of helping others, just as she had once needed help. "Thank you, Nathaniel," she said, her voice full of gratitude. "I don't know what to say. I never thought I'd be in a position like this. It means so much to me." Nathaniel's response was simple but sincere. "You've earned it, Madison. You've worked hard and you've proven yourself. This is your chance to make a real difference. I'm proud of you." The words left Madison speechless. She had worked so hard to get to this point, and now she was being given a chance to make an even bigger impact. She wasn't just surviving anymore, she was thriving. And the future, which had once seemed so uncertain, now looked full of possibility. Madison's story wasn't a fairy tale. It wasn't a story where everything magically got better overnight. There were still challenges ahead, and the scars of her past would never fully disappear. But what she had found was something far more meaningful than any happy ending. She had found hope. She had found the strength to keep going, even when it felt like the world was against her. And she had found the support of someone who truly cared, someone who saw her for who she was, not just as someone in need of help, but as someone with potential. Sometimes, the right people come into our lives at the right time. Madison had no idea when she first met Nathaniel that he would change her life. At first, she had thought he was just a rich man offering charity, but she soon realized that he was offering something much more valuable, a chance for redemption and dignity. His support wasn't just a handout, it was an opportunity for her to stand on her own, to rebuild her life, and to create a better future for herself and her children. And so, as Madison looked ahead, she felt a sense of peace that had been missing for so long. She still missed Lily every day, but she knew that she was honoring her memory by moving forward, by making the most of the second chance she had been given. She wasn't just a single mother struggling to survive anymore. She was a woman with a purpose, with a future, and with the strength to face whatever came next. In the end, the real gift Nathaniel had given her wasn't a job or money, it was the belief that she could create a better life for herself. It was the belief that no matter how hard life had been, she could still rise, still find hope, and still make a difference. And that was more than she had ever hoped for.